You're listening to a podcast from the Today programme on BBC Radio 4. Simon Jack is here with news of Google and the tax headache that won't go away, among other stories. Simon?
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yes, the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs at Google, Peter Barron, has said Google thinks the international tax system could do with some changes. Here he is speaking on BBC One's Andrew Marr programme yesterday.
We think that the international tax system, which has been around for a long time, since the 1920s, could do with reform, and we would like to see more simplicity and more clarity, not least because we would like to be seen to be paying the right amount and being seen to be paying the right amount.
Of course, they paid £130 million in back taxes, which they announced with some jubilation, thinking it would go down very well. In fact, it didn't go down very well at all. Now, one way of dealing with all of this mess might be to do away with corporation tax altogether and replace it with a sales tax charged at the point and the place of sale to stop this kind of tax avoidance. Former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lawson, is a big fan of this idea. Ben Southwood is from the Adam Smith Institute, here with me in the studio. And on the line is Prem Sikka, a Professor of Accounting at Essex University. Ben Southwood first, has corporation tax had its day?
Yes, there are two main reasons why I think corporation tax is a bad tax, particularly now. Firstly, is that corporation tax payers are often not seen as paying their due, even when they're following both the letter and sometimes even the spirit of the law. And secondly, is corporation tax distorts activity much more than other options we have to us.
OK, and because it seems in the case of multinationals that corporation tax at the moment seems almost a voluntary exercise.
So I don't know if that's true. The issue is that people don't it's very complicated to decide how much corporation tax firms actually owe. So, for example, Scotch whisky producers sell about half of their whisky in the US and China, but nearly all of the corporation tax is paid here. That's because we decide that most of the productive activity that goes into those bottles of whisky happens in Scotland. Similarly, Google does nearly all of its activities outside of the UK. So even though it generates quite a lot of profit here, it's decided that the productive activities behind that profit are elsewhere. That's why HMRC only charged it £130 million. OK, and a sales tax charged a bit like VAT would answer all that? Well, Google makes 4.6 billion of sales in the UK, and a sales tax would hit all of that depending on whatever rate we set it at.
OK, Prem Sikka, that sales tax would just eliminate this doubt.
Good morning. I very much doubt it, because sales can easily be shifted, and indeed that is one of the issues in the Google debate, but more...
When you say shifted, I mean, if I sit down here and I buy something from Amazon and I click it here in the studio, then we know that it was done in London and it was done in the UK, and therefore the tax should be payable there, no?
Well, corporate structures can be created to record the sales somewhere else. That is easily possible, and in recent years there have been a whole range of as you referred to the VAT avoidance schemes, where there's been all kind of international arbitrage on the rates as well. But the sales tax generally is a bad idea, because it really penalises small businesses, fledgling businesses, any business which is making a loss, because they will have to pay a tax. One can take a real-life example of steel companies at the moment really making losses, but they do have sales. So under this proposal, they will need to pay tax, which will actually worsen their cash flow position and hasten their demise. So it's really a bad idea.
So what about that, Ben Southwood? Companies which are ailing slightly or haven't grown to sufficient size and are still sort of in the red and building themselves up, you'd be taxing them before they've even made a penny of profit.
Well, there's 2 points there. One is that firms don't need to make a profit to grow. So in one big example, which you just used, is Amazon. Amazon only recently started making profits that you think of as sizable in relation to its revenues, but investors had confidence in it because they believed its plan to grow was a good one. So you don't necessarily penalise startups. Any startup with prospects loses money even under the current regime for almost decades sometimes before turning a profit. So that's fine. On the other hand, companies which are failing and don't have a future, there's no reason why we want those companies. If they don't make a profit, they're not producing productive activity for society to use. They're actually using up resources that we could put to better use.
So they should be put out of their misery?
Well, that's the meaning of a loss.
Put out of our misery?
If companies make persistent losses, that means they're not adding to society's economic output. That's why we have losses and profits.
Prem Sikka, you don't like the idea of a sales tax, but would you admit the corporation tax in its current form is ineffective?
I think it's only ineffective because it hasn't really been reformed in any fundamental way for nearly a century. And also, you got to ask yourself, who has been writing our tax laws? It is essentially big corporations, big accountancy firms who've been having a privileged position within government departments, and they've really been writing the laws which have got us into this difficulty. So we really need some measure of independence for the HMRC and Treasury from big business.
So are you saying that, in a way, the big accountancy firms have captured HMRC and the rule making?
I think they have become part of the state. They have captured the state, and we really need enforcement. If you look at it, in the last Parliament, Public Accounts Committee had 6 reports on organised tax avoidance. They held hearings. Not one of those was followed up by any test case by HMRC or the Treasury, and that in many ways indicates the kind of state we find ourselves in, really.
Do you sense that something is changing at the moment? We've been down this road before on corporation tax, and there's been howls of outrage, and then nothing really happens. But do you think the concerted effort by, for example, European Competition Commissioner Ms. Vestager on this programme last week said she was going to look into it. We've got France and Italy more aggressively pursuing it, that something looks like it's changing?
I think it certainly is that people are angry because ordinary people have seen their tax burdens increased, and at the same time they hear that big corporations at least don't appear to be paying their fair share. So there is a kind of anger, but this anger is in practical terms too, because people are seeing less investment in schools, hospitals, roads and so on. So people are very concerned about the social settlement which they have enjoyed since the end of the last war. That settlement is being eroded.
Prem Sikka, Ben Southwood, thank you both for that. Listening to all of that is Ewan Cameron Watt, Global Chief Investment Strategist at BlackRock, who, I dare say, is a big investor, or the firm is a big investor in many of these companies. What do you make of this debate? Do you want to get at this profit which is sloshing around in Ireland and never gets returned?
Well, Simon, I think we want clarity because, as was being explained previously, the system really leaves people unsure of what's being paid and leaves people unsatisfied with what's being paid.
Let's talk about oil prices. We see they've been obviously falling, and that is beginning to bite. We saw Azerbaijan last week asking the IMF and the World Bank for assistance, and now Nigeria. Most people thought when oil prices started falling that it was going to be a jolly good thing pretty much for the world. Does it have the potential to destabilise the global financial system when you see countries like Nigeria, like Azerbaijan, Russia having problems? Could it destabilise the financial markets?
Well, to a certain extent it is already, because some of the larger countries, Saudi Arabia, for example, and some of the other Middle Eastern countries, and I was visiting there last week, have had to sell financial assets to meet their budget needs because oil prices are so low. Major borrowers like Nigeria, Venezuela, who are, perhaps have very challenged economics, clearly, as you can see, are having to come in for emergency loans. So the transfer, it's a wealth transfer from the producer to the consumer, but it does leave the producers with some very big headaches to deal with.
And Barclays and Credit Suisse are settling federal and state charges. They misled investors in what they call their dark pools, which are sort of forums for trading shares. And they were saying that they basically were charged with not letting on to those investors that other types of investors, very sophisticated ones, were sharing those pools. $70 million fine for Barclays. Another reputational blow, or is this not going to touch the sides?
Well, I think it's probably, as you say, one of a long chapter. I mean, they don't call them dark pools for nothing. The transparency there is low for every participant. But it's part of the way the markets are developing. You have to deal in many different places now.
All right. Ewan Cameron Watt, Global Chief Investment Strategist at BlackRock. Thanks very much indeed for that. Now, a key part of government economic policy is under fire this morning. In a highly critical report, members of the Business Innovation and Skills Committee are asking whether the productivity plan can even be called a plan at all, describing it as an assortment of existing policies. They also say ministerial engagement with the plan is far too weak. The plan covers 15 areas, including transport, energy and infrastructure. It's also said to lack clear objectives. Ian Wright is chair of the BIS Select Committee, and he's on the line from BBC Tees. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Simon.
What's your problem?
Well, we agree with what the Chancellor's trying to do in terms of productivity is the pressing economic challenge, it's the driver in which we stay competitive, and it's the means by which we raise living standards. And so when the government came to power in May, the fact that the productivity plan was published soon after, we found of great hope. Having looked at the productivity plan in some detail, it's vague, it's a collection of existing policies rather than a step change in how we're going to improve productivity, and there's really no sort of driver in terms of how we're going to implement these steps to make sure that we can improve productivity over the medium to long term.
I suppose to have a good plan, you need to really understand what the problem is. And we are much less productive than France, even dare say Italy. And actually, if we were as productive as the French, we could have every Friday off.
That's true.
What is the problem?
Well, it's a number of things. It's essentially three drivers of productivity, and the government's analysis in the productivity plan is, to be fair, very, very good. So it's how do we invest in skills, how do we invest in new capital with research and development to be an innovative nation, and how do we invest in infrastructure. And in all of these things, there's vague policies. It's a repository of existing measures that the government want to put in place. But as we say in the report, that the notion that actually the plan is a driver to push forward improvements and can be measured effectively is virtually non-existent.
Well, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills say this. They say that we're seeing a return to productivity growth. Output per hour grew 0.5% in the third quarter of 2015 and was 1.3% higher than the same period in 2014.
You've got to look at, since the financial crash in 2008, British productivity is essentially plateaued, and other countries, although they suffered a knockback as a result of the global financial crisis as well, they've powered ahead. We won't stay competitive. We won't be able to compete in world markets, and our living standards won't rise unless we really address the productivity issue facing our country. And I'm afraid the productivity plan doesn't address that.
All right. Ian Wright, MP, Chair of the BIS Select Committee, many thanks for that.
You can listen to more free content from the Today programme by going to www.bbc.co.uk/today.